really fascinating conversation because it's that time of week for our weekly worldview conversation with FRC's director for the Center for Biblical Worldview, David Closson. We're going to unpack a question with him in just a moment. There's actually a blog article that I wrote that you can find that's up on frcblog.com. It's titled, "Is Diversity, Racial Diversity specifically, a Biblical Goal?" This is the question that we are going to discuss. It was inspired by a conversation I was having with my wife. She's an administrator at a classical school, and they were having this conversation, as many people are, and we are now going to discuss that with David Closson. David, good to see you, my friend.
Hey, great to see you. Greetings from Springfield, Missouri, Joseph. Just wrapped up a pastor's event here, and great to be on the show again with you.
Well, thank you for all you're doing out there, rallying the troops and getting them on board and helping them understand what we're dealing with. And I think this group of pastors that you were dealing with helps us understand. It's kind of a great example of where this conversation about racial diversity is taking place. Because I was talking about my wife who works in a Christian school. They're having this conversation about racial diversity. Churches are having these conversations about racial diversity. Lots of ministries are. Is this something that the church should have as an objective goal? And David, I want to start this conversation off by asking you, what does the Bible say about racial diversity?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joseph. And I think that when you go to Scripture, the first place that us as believers need to go to is Genesis 1:26, where it says that all of us are made in God's image. The Bible is absolutely clear. You go to the New Testament in James chapter 2, it talks about the sin of partiality, that we should never show favoritism because of secondary characteristics like income, class, race, things like that. But the question that you pose in the blog, Joseph, is you ask the question, is diversity a biblical goal? And then as you read the piece, and anyone can find this piece at frc.org/worldview, you ask the question, should congregations be making a concerted effort to be racially diverse? And my answer to that question, Joseph, is that it depends. I think it absolutely depends. I think there are many contexts and many situations where a congregation should absolutely be racially diverse if that congregation is in a community that is racially diverse. But I'm not going to heap guilt on a pastor who pastors in rural Kentucky in a county that's 99% white and tell him that his congregation absolutely has to be racially diverse when there's no racial diversity in his community. So I think it depends. And I think that is something that might strike people as maybe an odd answer, but it's a question that we just need to dig a little bit deeper and define our terms.
Well, you'd make a fine lawyer, David, because that's the question. That's the answer to every legal question is it depends or maybe. But, I think when we have this conversation about racial diversity, what we're generally thinking of is white churches in America that are surrounded by people who aren't necessarily white. Why is this just a white church? But there are other situations. You go to many large cities and you will find a congregation of Koreans or Ethiopians or the Latino community. They will have a Hispanic church. Are those problematic in the same way that people might look at an all-white church and say, well, you should be more diverse?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in some situations, Joseph, I don't think it's necessarily wrong. I don't think it's nefarious. I don't think it's evil. I don't think that at all. Now, I do think that all of us need to guard our hearts. Again, James 2 talks about the sin of partiality, and we're the only ones that know our hearts. And if in a Korean church or a Japanese church or in a white church, we're only admitting people that look like us into our membership, and there's a conscious effort underfoot to do that, then I think there probably is some soul searching that needs to take place. But in some context, I don't think that would be wrong or problematic.
Now, one of the arguments I make in the blog, and I want to work through with you, is part of the reason I think this is a difficult conversation, but also an important one, is because I think people have come to believe that racial diversity within a particular community is a sign of love. And I think they think that. And I think there's merit to that argument, because racism is, of course, evil and wicked. And we would look at a community that is racially diverse and say, there's not racism there. That would be our assumption. And therefore, there is love there. Therefore, when we have racial diversity within a community, that's an indication of love. But the argument that I make, and I want to discuss with you a bit, is the possibility that racial diversity can be a sign of love. It can be a sign of something good, but it is not necessarily something good in and of itself. And so if you put the cart before the horse and we conflate racial diversity and love, and we basically say racial diversity is a form of love, we can pursue racial diversity as an ends unto itself when, as I would argue and have now publicly argued, that racial diversity is actually the fruit of love. It is the effect of a community that loves itself and not itself something that is virtuous. What do you say to that?
I agree with that, Joseph. I think I just want to underscore what you said. I think because in conversations, especially in conversations about wokeness and CRT, there's a movement to say that the pursuit of racial diversity for the sake of racial diversity is somehow morally praiseworthy or morally good. And I would argue that racial diversity in and of itself is probably morally neutral. This reminds me of a conversation you and I had months ago about unity. People always say that unity is a good thing. Well, if you and I are unified and go commit a crime, it doesn't matter that we were unified. That was bad. Unity is morally neutral. I think racial diversity in and of itself is morally neutral. But I will say that as Christians who are commanded to love God and love others, as we are doing that, as we're following the great commandment, loving those, we're going to love those who don't look like us, don't sound like us, come from different backgrounds. So I do believe, and I think my own church in DC is a good example of this, we're becoming more racially diverse. And I think that that's an outworking of the gospel unity that we find, not necessarily because we're pursuing diversity simply for the sake of diversity.
Yeah. What I think is undeniable is the fact that racial diversity is practically useful, simply because when you're around people with different perspectives and different experiences, it makes you collectively wiser as a community. You understand things that you wouldn't understand if you were surrounded by people who are essentially just like you. Now, it's of course difficult to find any community where everyone is essentially just like you, and I would argue maybe that doesn't exist. But in an ethnic sense, there are certainly different cultures and backgrounds and experiences that when you bring those things together, you're stronger as a community. So I think we can imagine why we would see this as a valuable thing. But to your point about how it may be problematic to make it an end unto itself, what do you think are the risks if we as the church decide that the goal is not love, which leads to racial diversity, but racial diversity as an end unto itself?
You make the point in the blog pretty well, Joseph, is I think those churches, if you're just focused on diversity for the sake of diversity, it almost becomes kind of a selfish thing. Kind of we pat ourselves on the back because we're racially diverse or we're diverse with, a bunch of folks from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So again, I just think it's so important as Christians, the thing that keeps us united, the thing that holds us together is the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we can be reconciled to a holy God. That's the glue that holds us together. And as we get better at loving God and loving his people, I think we will have diversity reflected in our congregations and in our meetings. But again, it's important to start with the gospel. That's the focus. And then let the racial reconciliation, let the unity, all that will, Lord willing, be a good fruit that we reap because we're focused on loving God and loving neighbor.
And I would add to that if we make racial diversity a goal, it inevitably, though probably self-consciously, causes us to value people differently within our community prospectively because of their ability or their inability to bring racial diversity to our community. And if that's something we really want, well, you don't have that to offer to me. Therefore, I'm less interested in you than I am in somebody who could offer racial diversity to us. And of course, I think it's self-evident why that's a problematic way for Christians to treat other people. David, in about 30 seconds, what would you say to the pastor who may have felt guilty because most of his church looks the same?
I would just tell that brother to be faithful. Be faithful in preaching the gospel, discipling the folks in your congregation, to see all people made in God's image, see people the way God sees them, and give the results to Him. Let's trust the Lord and be faithful with what He's called us to do.
David Closson, thanks so much for your time. As always, great to be with you.
Thank you, Joseph.